All right, welcome to TLDR JavaScript, where we are going to tell you everything that matters in JavaScript to get you going here. The stuff that you're going to be using 80% of the time. We're going to be covering a lot of great topics as quick as we can to cover as much as we can. So what is JavaScript? Let's just first define that. JavaScript is the language of the web. It is the brains of the internet, if you want to think of it that way, when it comes, especially comes to front-end development. Although JavaScript can be used to build back-end applications, databases, mobile applications, desktop applications, where JavaScript thrives and lives and started out was in front-end web development. It is one of the three parts, triangle, of the parts of the internet when it comes to front-end development, which is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And it is how we make our pages interactive. It is how when we click a button, it knows to go and do something. When we want to add some numbers together, it knows how to do that, and that's JavaScript. When we hover over something, it goes and does some stuff. JavaScript allows our web pages to be dynamic, and it is an amazing thing, and that's basically it at the end of the day. So what are we going to be covering here? What are the major points? Well, we're going to be talking about the data types in JavaScript, sort of give some examples, some of the methods that stand out that are definitely important for you to know. We're also going to be talking about operators, and declarations and control flow. And we're going to be talking real quick a little bit about each one of these sections and what they're going to consist of. When it comes to data types, we're going to be talking about what are strings, what are numbers, what are booleans, objects, arrays, nulls, undefined. What is all that, right? What are some functions and methods that we're going to be using in JavaScript? How does that work? What do they do? How can I use them effectively? When it comes to operators, we're going to be talking about arithmetic operators, relational, equality, how to increment, decrement, assignment operators, all things that you're going to need to know when it comes to the logic aspects of JavaScript. And then finally, when it comes to declarations and control flow, what is let and const? How does if, else if, and else work? What is while and do while? What are for loops? What are switch statements? These are things that you're going to have to know. What are some things we're not going to cover? I don't have a slide for that. But what are some things that we're not going to cover? We're not going to be covering the vanilla JavaScript DOM manipulation. JavaScript is what's called an event-driven language, and that entails manipulating web pages. Those are things like the hovering, the clicking. Those are events. That's not what this video is about. This video is about the logic aspects that you're going to get going. The reason for that is as you progress in JavaScript, you're going to be using frameworks like React, Angular, Vue, jQuery, all that sort of stuff, and probably things by the time this video is out that I don't even know about, right? But that's going to handle a lot of the DOM manipulation, the vanilla JavaScript. Here we're going to be talking about the stuff of JavaScript that's never going to change, and the things that you need to know to be able to start thinking like a developer. So let's go ahead and start diving into it. If you're over there loving that JavaScript thing and you're thinking, you know what, man, I want a full stack JavaScript bootcamp. I wonder if Dylan can recommend one. I can. Might I recommend devmountain.com, Dev Mountain Coding Bootcamp, where tuition and housing is included for free, where you can get over there and learn not only full stack JavaScript, but iOS development, Salesforce development, quality assurance. But in terms of the full stack JavaScript, you're going to be picking up JavaScript, jQuery, Angular, Node, React, and a whole bunch of other great things. Check them out at devmountain.com. All right, if you want to be following along in the same text editor I am, I'll be using Visual Studio Code for our demonstrations and our exercises. You can go to code.visualstudio.com to download this IDE. You'll see it here. It's very nice. I'll also be using an extension called Quokka. If you click this little, I don't know why it's this weird square, but that's the extension icon. You'll see that I have this Quokka, Quokka.js. We're going to be using this as well for our application. So if you want to use that, I think it's kind of a cool tool, especially when you're just getting started and you just need somewhere to play around with. You can use Quokka. So let's go ahead and jump right in. All right, so let's go ahead and get started by creating a file here. We're going to go and call this index.js. This is just going to be our example folder, our play around folder. And go ahead and close that. And go ahead and hit F5. And if you have F1, start Quokka on this file. I'm going to close that. And you'll see here we have Quokka going out. And basically what this is going to allow us to do is console.log essentially let us write out code. And you'll see that we have this little 2. So as we're testing our code, we can kind of see what's going on here if we want to. So let's talk about data types. Data types are a huge part of any programming language, and there's several in JavaScript that you need to be aware of. Strings are one of them. So let's say we wanted to create a variable. A variable is a container. It stores value, right? That's basically it. So we're going to just call this example, and we're going to set this equal to hello world. This is a string. A string is a series of text, basically, at the end of the day. And if we wanted to print that out, we could use console.log. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that let's go ahead and take this out real quick. You'll see that we're able to reference this because we stored it in a variable here in our console log. You'll also notice that we use single quotes. Now, we can switch it to double quotes. Obviously, we can't have one single and one double, but that would work as well. As of ES6, we have these backticks that lets us do some pretty cool stuff. So far you say, oh, well, what's the difference? Well, between single quote and double quote, nothing. But let's say we have, we'll just create this, and we'll call this ex2, and we'll set this to be equal to world. Say we wanted to actually inject this. In the past, what we might have to do here is go ahead and do ex2, and you'll see here it adds a space, hello world. Doesn't look all that good, and it's a little bit dirty. So what we can do is what's called string interpolation here. Add this $sign in these 2 curly braces, and we're going to throw in our variable ex2, and you'll see now it's actually injecting world in here. One thing that's a little different than other programming languages is that strings and characters are the same. Okay, some programming languages will have characters be their own data type. That's not the case. It's just a character being a single character of a string. In JavaScript, they're all the same. So these are strings at the end of the day, and we can do some pretty cool stuff with them. So a string has a property called .length. Or length rather, and what that means is strings, you can essentially, you'll see we have this hello world. It's 11 characters, 11 counting the empty space here as well. So hello is 5, world is 5, and this empty space is 11. Say we needed to get that length, we could with .length. You see we get 11 out here. That's one of the properties of string. Some other things to consider is strings have about 20 or 25 different methods or functions. These are special things that we can do, a set of instructions that we can go and do to the string. Like let's say instead of actually getting the length, we wanted hello world to be in uppercase. We could call on the string example.to uppercase, like so, and you see hello world will come out here, and vice versa. If we wanted to call .to lowercase, we could do that as well. Another one to keep in mind is trim. So this might be a little hard to see here, but if we were to actually call the length of this string right, like we did earlier, it's now going to be 31. Trim will take the empty characters on the left side, on the right side of the string, and remove them before it, trim, and you'll see now when we call .length on it, we can get 11 again. You also notice how we can chain these together, these functions. So we have our original string, which we then shorten, and then we get the length of again. One more thing I wanted to show is the split method of strings. This is going to allow us to take our string and turn it into an array of strings. So before we move on, let's go ahead and just return that back to normal. So split takes in what is called a value, a parameter, and you'll see if we put an empty character here, it's going to actually split the words on every single character. So you'll see this is called an array, and we'll dive a little bit more into arrays later on in this section. Just split is a very commonly used thing, especially when you're getting started doing basic algorithms. And you'll see it's breaking out this string here into an array of every single character, even the empty character. And say we wanted to break it out into a word array, we're going to break it out on this empty space here, and now we have our 2 words in our list. So those are just some methods I want to talk about. Let's go ahead and dive a little bit into numbers next. All right, so numbers are pretty much exactly what you would expect in JavaScript. One thing to keep in mind, if you're more familiar with more object-oriented languages and traditional languages, there may be several different number types. That's not how JavaScript works. There is just number. If we have a floating number, currently we have an integer, but let's say we do 724 for 7 days a week, 24 hours a day or something like that. We get 7.24. That's still a number. It's not a floating point number. Now, one of the things that we can do is we can call upon the number type, and we could actually parse an integer from there. That's one of the cool things that we can do. Let's say we only care about the integer. We want to parse that. And you'll see we'll only get the 7. Now you can also parse a float, which is fine. This will parse a float and gives us our number. But let's say we wanted to drop. We wanted to round this to, or not even round it. We just wanted one index value here. How would we go about that? Well, we use this wonderful toFixed, and let's actually just do 5. And you'll see it's actually going to add zeros on. But if we did, something like I don't know, what's a good one? We'll just hold down 3 for a while. You'll see that it's going to actually drop them off, and we'll only get to 5 places. And if we want to get to 1. There, if we even just wanted to get to 0, we could do that, and negatives aren't going to work, right? Because that just doesn't work that way. And the reason it says up to 20 is because JavaScript has a cap of numbers that are quote unquote safe, and that's beyond the scope of this. But you can get 3 places. So that's a little bit about numbers. You can add numbers as you might expect. Let's just for the simplicity go back. So you can add numbers. We can multiply by numbers. We can minus by numbers, we can divide by numbers, and we'll go a little bit into modulo and things like that later on in the video. So a Boolean value is the next data type we're going to talk about. This is essentially true or false at the end of the day, and that's really it. There is a little bit more there's a little bit more complicated aspects to it. So you have true, you have false. Notice that they're both lowercase. There are things called truthy values and falsy values in JavaScript, and this is part of the. If you see a lot of hate for JavaScript, this is part of it. So let's go ahead and take our. You can use this Boolean word, and this is going to return true or false if it. For the Boolean value. So in this case it's false, and we want to get the Boolean value of something. So the Boolean value of false is false. The Boolean value of true is true. Nothing changes there, but there are some very strange things that happen in JavaScript where if we put in like single quotes, this is going to return false. If we were to have any words or a space, that would return true, and that doesn't matter for quotes. And I don't even know if it matters for backticks for that matter. No, it doesn't. So there's also, false returns false for the Boolean value. Let's actually, it looks like the IntelliSense is giving us some issues, so we'll just go ahead and put that down a couple lines. 0 will return false as well. 1 will return true. So sometimes you might see that interchangeably. A little note as well, -0 returns false. Null and undefined, which we'll talk about a little bit later, returns false. So is undefined, as well as not a number, which is a very unique data type that we're not really going to cover in this video. So Booleans are true or false values at the end of the day. Yeah, you can think of it as a coin. One side is true, one side is false. It's always, use Booleans when it's always going to be one thing or another. And it's very helpful when we get to control flow and if statements and how that all works. So Booleans are something you're going to have to be very comfortable with moving forward. In terms of truthy values, it's basically anything that has a value. Hello world. a number, anything there. So truthy values and falsy values are something that are a little bit strange for a lot of developers when you're just getting started, but it's something to be aware of when you, and it will cause you issues when you're getting started if you aren't aware that this is a thing in JavaScript. All right, so let's talk about arrays. We showed you a little bit earlier when it came to JavaScript or to strings, how to split a string into a string array, an array of strings. So what is an array? An array at the end of the day starts off with these little little brackets here. And what it is it's a list. Whenever you want to deal with multiple values, you're probably going to be using an array. Now, there's a property on array called .length, right? So remember how we could check the length of a string and see how long it is? In arrays, we can see how many items are in the array. Right now it's 0. So if we wanted to add 0, actually we'll do 11, 10, 8, 5, 4. Something like that, you'll see that we have a length of 5. There are 5 values in here. Another thing to keep in mind when it comes to arrays, that you can access them by putting in what's called an index value. So if we put index 0, you'll see we'll get 11. Arrays start on the 0 index. They don't start at 1. So this is 0, this is 1, this is 2, this is 3, this is 4. So even though the length is 4, if we were to actually try, or length is 5 because there's 5 items, but there's up to 0 to 4 for the index values. If we were to check 5 here, we're going to get undefined because there's no 5th index. There's a 0, which is 11. There is a 1, which is 10. There is a 2 that is 8. There's a 3 that is 5, and there is a 4 that is 4. Now let's talk a little bit about some of the more common ways to work with arrays, and there are a ton. Arrays, this is one of the most important topics. We're only going to be talking about 5 methods that are part of arrays, but there's probably about 20 that you really should know inside and out. It's going to be one of the largest parts of your learning when it comes to JavaScript, and I go into, in my course, break it all out. Little shameless self-promotion, link in the description below, get it with a coupon. Shameless self-promotion, but really this is going to be the most important data type, arrays and objects, that you're going to have to master because of how crucial they are. So let's just talk a little bit about how do we add values to an array. Say I want to add a new item to an array. You have what's called push. So we can take our example and we say .push, and we'll push, I don't know, 100 to it. And you'll see like so, bam. Now we have a new value here. We can also use pop to remove the last value. Pop is the way that we can remove the ending value. So we have example.pop, and you'll see we'll lose that. We can pop again if we wanted to, although I've never, not on the same pop. We can go example.pop, and we remove another value. Now we don't have that 4 that was originally in there. There's also the ability to shift. So let's say we want to, I always get shift confused with, and you'll notice that if we're using one thing I should mention is that if we're using Visual Studio Code, we have what's called IntelliSense, which will bring up these functions that deal with this data type. And you'll see here, you can see when shift removes the first element from an array and returns it. So let's say we wanted to remove the very first element, which is 11. We could do that by just calling shift on it. And now we don't have 11 there. Now how would you imagine that we would add to the very first element? Well, of course it would be unshift, right? Makes a lot of sense. Where we could throw 5 in there, and now we have 5 as our array value. And you'll notice that these are all chaining downwards, 1 and 1. This is called JavaScript is synchronous in this example, so meaning it goes sequential order. It instantiates the array, it then adds a value, it then removes a value from the end, it removes another value from the end, it then removes a value from the beginning, then it adds a value to the beginning, which leaves us with 5, 10, 8, and 5. Now let's go ahead and just comment that out, and we'll go back to our original array. There's also what's called slice. Say we want to specifically remove that 10 value. Now we can take our example and we can slice it out, meaning that we want to remove the 0 index, and you'll see that, oops, what did I do wrong? Oh, excuse me, splice. I said slice, didn't I? Splice. So we'll splice it out of the array. And now our 10 is gone. And so you're wondering, what is slice then? Well, let's say we wanted to get a value out of an array, but we didn't want to change the array. You see how slice actually removed the 10? Let's, in our example here, instead create a value, and we'll just call it results. And we'll change this to slice, and say we want to console.log those results. There we go. So we're going to take the 11. Slice is going to return the values in an array format because we can slice multiple values. So you'll see here we're only slicing from the 0 index to the 1 index. Which is one value, right? 0 to 1, not counting one. Say we want 0 to 2, 0 to 3. A little worth noting, if you don't slice with any values, it's just going to make a copy of the array. Now, one other thing is, say we want that 10 value, it would be 1 to 2, and then we get an array of 10. Now, in the past, when we have gone and there's primitive types and then there's other types, and we're not going to dive too much into that, but let's say that we wanted to, one thing that's going to get very confusing right now, but it's worth bringing up, is that arrays, you have to actually go out of your way to create a new array. And what I mean by that is, let's say we have example 2 here, and we're going to set this equal to example 1. This is going to create a reference, and right down below we're going to go ahead and log out example 2. So you'll see right here, we have the same values in the array. Now what's going to happen is if we say example2.push and then we push, I don't know, 77, it's actually going to affect example 1. Let's put a 1 on that instead of just example. Example 1 as well, because what's happening here is we're creating a reference. We're not actually creating a brand new array, which is why we're going to bring up map, filter, and reduce as well to show you some of the ways that you can create a new array and go from there. So a lot of times this isn't what you want to do. If you're setting a variable equal to an array, 99% of the time you actually just want it to be a duplicate of the array values but not of the array itself, which is very, very confusing, and I've ran into a lot of issues when I first started learning programming why this was happening. So let's go ahead and talk about how we can create a new value here. So say this example 1, what we can do is we can just map a new array out, and what that means is it takes in multiple arguments. In our example, we're just going to pass in this parameter meaning element, and what that is all that is the value in, and you'll notice I'm using an arrow function. This is just a callback function. This is, a lot of people get very concerned when you start doing callback functions. All this really means is call a function on every value that's in the array. So every time for every value, in this case we have 11, 10, 8, 5, 4, do something with that. Call this function every single time. And all the map function does is it allows us to return an element. So now you'll notice that when we map a brand new array, which creates a new array in the process, that even though we're pushing to example 2, example 1 is never touched. You can do more, there's multiple ways to accomplish this, but map is particularly useful because let's say you have an array of values and you want to change it ever so slightly. You just want to add 1 to the array values. You can do that where we've now created a brand new array and we've added 3 to every single value there. And this will create a new array. Reduce and filter will create a new array as well, but they have different values. So filter takes in a callback function as well, and I'm calling it element, but you can call it whatever you want. And this is going to allow us to filter out values that return true or false. So we'll have our return statement here, and let's say we only want to return values that are greater than 8. So return element, the value that we're checking, that is greater than 8. And so you'll see now that filter will create a brand new array, and the only value that's greater than 8, 5, and 4 are not, 10 and 11 are, and so we can filter out those values that we no longer need and create a new array in the process, which is why 77 isn't added. One more thing, actually two more things I want to showcase is reduce. So reduce is another way of creating a new value, a new array, and reduce will do something that is, and we're going to get rid of this as well because we're not going to push to the array anymore. Let's say we want to return all the numbers added together. Reduce can do a lot of things, but this is one of the things that we can do. So I'll return element. It takes in two values. The value that you're iterating over, element 1 and element 2 for this instance. And so we want to take element 1 and we want to add element 2. And you'll see we get 38. Now what this really is, this first value is the value that we're storing. And then the element 2 is each iteration that we're going over, and we end up with 38. But this will also create a brand new array. You notice how we don't have 38 in example 1. The last thing I want to show you is for each. This is a simple way of iterating through your array to do something, and we'll just call it element. So let's say you want to run through your array one time and do something, and you just want to console.log the value of the element. You'll see you can do that. And it's just going to run through all the values. And you'll notice that this is undefined. It's because for each doesn't create a new array, it doesn't do anything. So there's no need for this example 2. It doesn't exist. There's no reason for it to exist. This is just if you want to iterate through every value of the array. So we're definitely getting into some more advanced concepts here when you're getting started with arrays. And there's about 20 other methods that we could go over. But for the sake of this video and for trying to keep it to about an hour, these are the ones that I think are most important when getting started. There are probably about 5 to 10 other ones that are equally as important, but these are the ones that I think are enough to get you going. All right, so let's talk about objects. Objects are really important when it comes to the JavaScript. You'll see here I have these two curly braces. That's an object. All right, we're done. Move on. No, objects are a little bit more complex than that, but this is the basic starting point of an object. Objects have what are called keys and values, right? So in our example here, we're going to go ahead and set a key, which is name, and the value, which is Dylan. You'll see we're printing it out here. No big deal. We'll just space this out. So we'll actually call this first name, and then we'll go ahead and say last name, and that'll be Israel, and we'll go ahead and say middle name, coding God, actual legal middle name, check my birth certificate. Okay, so we have this object. This is our key and this is our value. What does that mean? Well, if we wanted to get the value of first name, we could do that just by calling our object, which is example1.firstname. Now we're just getting our first name. If we want to do the same thing for middle name, we do the same and get coding God. And of course for last name, we could do the same as well. Now, when it comes to objects, it can be multiple data types. They don't all have to be strings. They don't all have to be numbers. So we'll do age, for instance, 30. And then we could do an array in our object if we wanted to. So it would be an array value, cats, 3. So we'll do string value of Milo, a value here of Tito, and you can even do different types of values in arrays, as we learned earlier, and even an object. So let's go and throw a name in here of Achilles. I don't know how to spell our cat's name, but I think this is it. Your boy's not the best speller. And we'll say age here, 2. So you can have this array of objects here. And let's just go ahead and say, you'll see .age, just so you can see everything's getting set. And then you see we do the cats. And we can target that with the array, as we saw earlier, with a 0. A 1 would be Tito. a 2 would be our object, Achilles, with age 2. And we could even target this as well and say, look, I just want to know Achilles' age or name, and we can target it like that. So you see, we're taking our object and saying, look, getting the cats array, specifically index 2, and then calling the name value of it. You can also use Boolean handsome. This is, of course, true. No semicolon there, excuse me. Handsome, set to true. So you can see we can use multiple data types. Excuse the narcissism. No, it's just trying to have some fun, guys. So handsome, but you can see that we can have objects in arrays. We can have objects within objects, different data types. So address, we could put an object here with street, and we'll go ahead and put LOL because I ain't telling you guys shit. We can do city, capital LOL, and so on and so forth. So if we wanted to access that, all we would do is chain our items here, which would be address.street, and we could get LOL, and so on and so forth. So objects are a really big important part of data, specifically JavaScript object notation, and we'll talk a little bit about that next. So JavaScript object notation is basically the way that we get data from databases nowadays and get items delivered, because the front end's JavaScript, so they need to send the data back as a JavaScript object. Now, they're like, okay, well, why don't they just send it back as JavaScript object? It's not the best way of sending it. So all this data here in the database is actually stored as a string most of the time. So we have this here. So one thing that we can do, and you're saying, well, how do we parse that string? How do we stringify the string? So we have this JSON that only has really two things that it does. It stringifies an object, and it looks the same, right? But basically what's happening here is this is now becoming a string. You can tell in this example here where this is in quotes. That's one of the things that JSON stringify naturally does, is to put quotes around our keys. And technically, if you wanted to in your object, this would work just fine. This is bad practice though in modern JavaScript. There's no need to do that. But let's say that we wanted to, let's actually store this in a value. So we'll say let JSON equal this. And then we wanted to output our JSON. Still be a long string, but let's say now that we stringified it, we wanted to say something like JSON.firstName. You'll see we're getting undefined. Why is that? Because this is actually a string now. And one way that we could check that is we call JSON.length. You'd see that it's 183 characters long. Another way that we can check that is we could do type of, and you'd see that it's a string. Now, if we did type of example1, it would be an object. And then vice versa, the number 5, it would be a number. If we did true, it would be a Boolean. And if we did 0, it would be a number. But it could also be false in the way that we evaluate it. Neither here nor there. But JSON, we stringify it typically before we send it to the database. So we just send it as a string, and then when it comes back as a string. But then how do we get it back into an object? It's pretty straightforward here. Let's just go ahead and reset our example1, and we're going to set JSON.parse, and we're going to pass in our example, our JSON that we just set up here, our variable. And now when we take example1, it is now back into our example, and if we wanted to get first name, we could again. So just something I wanted to bring up about how you can take an object, turn it into a stringified JSON, and then you could take that stringified object and turn it back into an actual object that you can use once again. Let's go ahead and cover a little bit of 3 or 4 of the more popular methods that you'll be using with objects next. Okay, so sometimes you'll need to find out if a property even exists, right? So as we showed earlier, we said something like, let's say we wanted to get ethnicity, for instance. It's undefined. I'm clearly Caucasian, though. if anyone's confused. That's supposed to be a joke. Anyhow, but ethnicity here is not defined. But how would we check to see if it is using the object methods? Well, there's this wonderful has own property method that we can throw on here. And what we can ask is, okay, well, is first name defined in here? And you'll see it's true, right? We do have a first name key. And vice versa for ethnicity. Ethnicity is false, right? Because there is no ethnicity in our object here. That's one of the more common methods. Another thing to keep in mind is that the object class, so if we wanted to use some of the static methods, and we can talk another time about what the difference is between static methods and whatnot. What you really have to know is that the object methods that we're going to be using right now are essentially static at the end of the day, or prototype methods. And what we're going to say is, hey, what are the keys? Oops, object.keys. What are the keys in this object? That's all I want to know. And so, what did I do? Oh, we have this. There we go. And you'll see here we get an array of all the keys in here. Now notice how it doesn't actually go and get name and age of cats. It's just going to give us the key on the level that we're checking right here. You'll see address. There's no street or city. It's just address, but it will give us the keys. And vice versa, we can get the values as well, doing object.values. And you'll see that we'll actually get all the values, but we won't get any of the keys to target them, but sometimes that's all you'll want. There's a lot of other great things to use. One more thing that I'm going to showcase real quick is just the for in. Say we actually want to iterate through all the values. I'll just iterate through our object for whatever reason, and we could do a for in loop. And what that is, we're going to set we can just say key in example 1. And we'll just go ahead and console.log key, which is essentially doing what we did with keys before, except now we're just printing them out instead of returning it as an array. But this would be an example of how we would iterate through. Again, because of the way that this works is we're only getting we could say our key here is essentially an element, first name. So if we did key.firstName, it's only going to return the first name for one of them. The rest is going to return undefined. Or excuse me, first name key dot. So this is our key. If we wanted to get the value, we could do something like this, example 1. Then we could wrap our key in it to get it. But we're getting a little complex. But this is just the reason I wanted to show this is that this is just one way for you to iterate through a object. So last but not least, we're going to talk a little bit about null and undefined. These are things that are equally as important. There's also not a number. We're not going to focus on that in this course, but just be aware that it's a thing, and you may have some issues here with that. I don't know if it's technically a type, but that's something that should be talked about in a more detailed course than this. So you'll see here we're actually in an undefined value. So say you wanted to, for some reason, instantiate your object like so, you could with just a semicolon and not actually give it a value. It's going to inherit undefined. You could also, for some reason, if you wanted to, set it to undefined, although this is, I think, considered bad convention because it's more code that does the same thing. Now you can also set it to null. So what is the real difference between null and undefined? Well, undefined typically is something that is being set as a value, is either something got missed completely or a value hasn't been set. Null means there is no value, which is it's hard distinction. But one thing to keep in mind is if we console.log example1.Dylan or name, for instance, cannot read proper name of null. Let's go ahead and make this an object real quick. You'll see we get an object here, then we get undefined, which means that this name property doesn't even exist. Now, if there was a name property that had a null value, what that basically means is that this null value hasn't been assigned, but the property does exist. They are both going to be falsy values, but I just wanted to sort of make that minor distinction between null and undefined. But it's to go any deeper than that would be beyond the scope of this video, but just something to keep in mind. right, so let's talk about arithmetic operators, basically math operators. What are they? What do they do? Well, JavaScript works just like you would expect math. So where 5 plus 5 is 10. It's amazing. 5 plus 5 minus 4 is going to be 6. So you can subtract. In terms of styling, in terms of this will all work, but it is better. It's considered better convention to space it all out. You can also divide by as well. You'll notice that it's actually doing the math property. We don't actually have to do this. JavaScript understands the rules of math, as every programming language should, and so just for the sake of it, I'll show this. But 5 plus 5 is 10, minus 2 is 8, right? We can also multiply as well. So let's say we want to multiply that by 4. We're going to get 2, because what is, just get rid of this at this point. So 2 times 4 is 8. 10 minus 8 is 2. So you can multiply. Now, there's also some other arithmetic operators that are a little bit more complex. You have this double multiplication times 5, and let's actually do this 2 to the 2. What this is not, this isn't actually multiplying. This is 2 to the power of 2. Now this is a feature that is that I believe isn't necessarily supported by all browsers. So if you're going to be using this, just be aware that you may run into some issues. There's a math library that we could use to put something to a power. So if we did this 3 to the third power, that's going to be equal to 3 times 3 times 3, which is 27, right? 3 times 3 is 9, times 3 is 27. Then we did it to the fourth power, it's going to go 81, because 27 times 3 is 81, of course. But you get the idea. So that's one thing to do. But basically, everything you should know about math. The thing that may be a little bit new to you is the modulo operator. What does that mean? What does that do? What does this percent sign mean? It essentially means return the remainder of something. So if we have 4 modulo 4, it returns 0, because 4 divided by 4 has no remainder. If we have 5 modulo 4, it returns 1, because after we divide by 4, all that's left over is 1, and that's what we're returning with the modulo operator. Vice versa, if we go up to 6, it's going to return 2. If we go up to 7, it's going to return 3. And finally, if we go back up to 8, it's going to return 0, because it divides evenly into it. So what happens when we modulo a smaller number by a larger number? It's just going to return the whole number, right? Because it never evenly divides anything. So it's going to return the whole number. So if we have a 1, 0 modulo 4, negative 1 modulo 4, it's going to return negative, right? So that's the modulo operator. It just returns the remainder of an item. All right, let's talk a little bit about relational operators now. So we have our example here, and let's actually zoom in just a little bit. That's pretty large, but we'll roll with it. So what are relational operators? They're basically ways to, similar to the math operators, remember this greater than or equal to? This is going to essentially evaluate our code and find out if a true or false value. Is 5 greater than or equal to 5? Yes, it is. Is it equal to 5? Yes, it is. Is it double equals to 5? Yes, it is. And we'll talk in just a second about what that means. Is it less than or equal to 5? Yes, it is. Is it less than equal to 5? No, it isn't, right? 5 is not 5. But is 4 less than 5? Yeah, it is. So we have greater than. We have less than. We have less than or equal to. We have greater than or equal to. Those are the easy ones, the relational operators. So what was this double equals and what was this triple equals? Well, let's start by making a number 5 and a string 5. So when we do double equals, we see we get a true value. Why is that? Well, double equals, JavaScript is what's called a dynamically typed language. And what that means is that you can change values of, in a lot of languages, when you have a number 5, like so, if we wanted to then reset that value, for example, 1 to be equal to, I don't know, an empty array, for instance, you could do that in JavaScript. A lot of other languages won't let you do that, but JavaScript is dynamically typed. And because of that, it allows us to do some very, by most people's standards, strange things. So let's say we just want to see if number 5 is equal to string 5? That's true because the double equals is checking the value and not the type, meaning that this is value 5, this is value 5, but this is type of number and this is type of string. So that is what we call loosely equals, and in general you want to not do this. It's very bad practice, but it is something to be aware of. And you'll notice right now that's returning true, right? Number 5 is equal to string 5 because all we're checking is the value. But let's say that we want to check the type and the value. So we have value 5, number 5, cool, that first check is good. But now we're doing a triple equals, which means we're doing a strictly equals, and we're checking the type as well. So number is not equal to string, which is why it returns false. So keep that in mind. In general, you're going to always be using triple equals. It's good coding convention and it's something that you should adhere to. JavaScript, although it is dynamically typed language, is moving in a direction to be more strict with its coding, which is why things like TypeScript exist. I actually introduced some equality operators in the relational operators, so I apologize about that earlier. But one more thing that I wanted to show about the equality operators is we only showed equal to. There's also this not equals to, which works exactly like how you would imagine, except we're checking the not value, right? Is 5 not equal to, it might be a little easier here to put 5. No, that's a false statement, right? Because 5, string, type, and value is returning false. Even if it's just value, because we have this single equals, is returning false. Now, if we did the double equals on it, the not double equals, it's going to return true, right? Because the value of 5 is equal to 5, but the type number is not equal to the type string, which is a false statement, which then returns true, right? Because it's not, that is not true, which then returns the value. So that's just one more thing I wanted to show. When it comes to, I kind of combined relational and equality operators, but another equality operator to keep in mind. All right, so let's talk a little bit about increment and decrement, and we're also going to be talking about the assignment operators as well. So what is increment and decrement? So you'll see we have our variable here, example 1, and we want to, let's say we just want to add 1. There's actually a really easy way that we can do that, is we can say example 1 plus plus. You see it there is equals 6, which is nice, right? You can also minus 1, which is minus minus. Very cool. It's a very easy way to increment and decrement when it comes to JavaScript. Now, oddly enough, you'll see here we do plus plus, and we still get the same value, and we get minus minus. So what's the difference between doing a plus plus or a minus minus on the beginning of a string or ending of a string? Well, let's actually do it in the console log here. Let's get rid of this and go to the console log exactly. So if we do plus plus, you see it's nothing's really happening. If we do minus minus, nothing's really happening. Why is that? Well, because it happens after this line. Basically, we're adding on this line in this sort of sequential order. Now, if we did it on the beginning here, which is 4, and we did it on the beginning here, which would return 6, it's because that's the difference. Is we are essentially telling JavaScript on this line we want it to increment this value because it's important for this line. Now, does this come in into a lot of things? No, most of the time you'll see plus plus or minus minus on the end, but it is worth making note that that is something that can happen. Now, what happens if we want to actually set example 1 to something? We don't want to just increase by 1. How would we go about that? Well, we could have example 1 plus equals 5. And it's going to actually add 5 to it exactly like that. And this plus equals, if we were to write it out, would essentially be example 1 is equal to example 1 plus 5. Same exact thing. It's just a shorthand of doing it. And vice versa for minus equals 5. We can minus 5 like this as well. We can also multiply 5 this way as well as divide 5 this way as well. It is, again, exactly the same thing as putting example 1 divided by 5. This is some of the ways that we can increment and decrement. Honestly, the plus equals, if that's what you need to do, is the preferred way when it comes to writing clean code. You can also do the modulo operator. Remember I talked about modulo, where we can say example 1 modulo 5 is going to return 0 because 5 divided by 5 is 0. If we did this by 4, it's going to have a remainder of 1. We can do the same thing with our operator here to return modulo as well. Let's talk a little bit about variables now. We're in the declarations section. So far you've been seeing me only use let. There's technically 3 types of declarations. There's var, which will work just fine. There's a reason we don't use var anymore, and we'll talk about that right now. So there's var and let, which is the new version of var. Moving forward as a developer, you no longer want to use var at all. It's essentially been deprecated, if you want to think of it that way. Basically, there's an issue with var and let. And to give you a very brief example, let's create a variable here called I, and I is equal to 0, while I is less than 5, I plus plus. So we're going to be going over for loops in a second, but this is a good way to give an example. So what this for loop does is it iterates through the code. And so you'll see here, it goes through 5 times. Remember, plus plus adds 1. It goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it stops. However, if we were to console.log the value of I right here, we would actually get access to it, and it would be 5. The reason for that is we're using var, which uses and this is okay if you don't fully understand this. This is an introduction video. But the reason for it is it uses what's called function scope, essentially. And what that means is that variables get hoisted to their parent scope, essentially, and it gets hoisted to this level. And now we have access to I, which has a value of 5, and it's not as strict, and it causes a lot of issues. So let was introduced, where now if we do let, it's called block scope, which means this block of code is the only place that let is, and you'll see I is not defined, which allows us to not make those errors and cause a lot of issues down the road. So a very brief example of why we're using let, but for the most part, if you see someone use var, no longer use var as an awful thing. You should be using let, and let allows us to, similar to var, allows us to reset values as well. So if we want to set that to 10, example is now 10. There's one more declaration we need to talk about, and that's const. So I'm going to change this let to a const, and you'll say assignment to const variable, and you'll see it's not printing. The reason for that is const refers to constant, right? So when you're going to use a constant, you can use const for the primitive values. Primitive values being numbers, and we'll go ahead and give an example here. So primitive values being numbers, primitive values being strings, primitive values being true or false. So those sort of primitive values. Now, why am I saying primitive values? Well, something that's not a primitive value is an array. And say we wanted to push to that array and modify it, even though it's a const, we could. But if we wanted to completely override that value and set it equal to 8, for instance, we would have an issue. This is the same when it comes to objects as well. So let's say we have an object, right? We can't push to it because it's not an array, but we could set the name equal to Dylan. So don't think it's a constant in the same thing, but we also can, of course, set example 1 equal to 5. So it's a little bit stricter is the point of it, but when it comes to arrays and const and objects, there's a little bit more breathing room, but something to consider when you're working with your variables and your variables and different data types for your declarations. All right, so let's talk a little bit about if, else if, and else, and how they work and what they do. So an if statement is an if, else if, and else statements are conditions that control the flow of your code. That's control flow. What I mean by that is you can set up an if statement with these blocks that if what's in here is true, and we're just gonna hard code it to true, it's gonna do something, right? So in our case, just console.log ran. And you'll see it is running. But if this is false, we're never actually going to get this because this code never runs because this condition here is not true. And so we can do example 1 like so. And you're like, okay, well, this is true. And you pass variables in. and this is false, so it doesn't run. You can also, remember those equality operators that we talked about? Is 5 less than 4? That's false, right? And then that's not going to run. But is 5 less than 6? Yeah, it is. One other thing that I actually forgot to cover was you can do, let's talk a little bit about and or, which is something that we haven't covered. So let's say we want to see if two things are true. So is this true and this true? It runs. But if this is, so both these sides of this this and essentially means both sides have to be true. So if one of these is false, our code here in this block is not going to run. Now, there's also the or operator, which only one of these has to be true to run. Either or, right? So if both are false, it's not going to run, right? But if one is true, it is going to run. So that's our and or operators, which I forgot to cover. My apologies. So this if statement does that. So what is an else if? So an else if is a statement that only runs if the previous if statement fails. So else if true, we'll just put true in here, and we'll console.log else if ran, and we'll go ahead and put an if ran here. So, and because good syntax, let's go ahead and put a semicolon. So you'll see this isn't running because our or statement, our if statement here is running. Now if we change this to an and, it's going to fail because it's going to return false here because this is now failing. This if statement never runs, or it does run, it just doesn't pass its condition here. So our else if is true and thus it runs. Now it will be evaluated similar to how anything else is. It's not always going to run. The else if only runs if its previous if fails. And you can nest these else ifs as well. So if we have an if and we want to have another else if, we could do that as well. So else if else if true, and we'll just console.log second else if ran. You notice it's not running, right? Only this one's running because this else if is saying, look, this if statement needs to return false, this if statement needs to return false. Otherwise, I can never run. But if they all return false, so does I finally get a chance to check my condition here, and then it runs. Again, it's not always going to run, only if this statement here evaluates to true. And then finally, there's the else. Now, just if it's not apparent, you can't have an else if or an else if there's no if, right? The if always needs to be there. So this else statement, you'll notice there's no condition here. The reason for it is the else is really the default value if everything else fails, right? You only run this if everything else is false. And so we'll just go ahead and put a little log here, console.log else ran. And so you'll notice that this is true, this is false, this is false, so this is true, this runs, we go false here, and bam, our else runs. But if we change this to true, if any of these are true, else never runs. That's really it. Else is the default value. And so you'll be using a lot of these with this is how you control the flow of your code. So that's if, else if, and else. So let's go back to make an array real quick, and we want to create a value here, and we're just going to go ahead and put Dylan, put a value, and we'll do coding, and we'll do a value here, and then we'll do God, and then we'll do a value here, Israel. All right, so that's our array. Let's say we want to iterate through this array, and we already talked about for each. Let's just talk about a basic for loop. We want to iterate through for a set amount of times. How many times? In this case, we'll do the length of the array. So how do we remember? Let's sort of chain this together, right? So example1.length is so we'll say, well, example1.length, or excuse me, yeah, example1.length is greater than I. Why that's a true statement. I++. We can iterate through it, and all we want to do here is console.log example1. Oh, that's all we're trying to do. We're trying to print out each value for it here. Example1's index value, which is I. So I is the current value. We're starting, remember, array start at 0. And then we're saying, while this is a true statement, go ahead and print this out. And actually, I put this in a wrong way. Normally, you would see I is less than example.length. Same thing in this case, just a weird way of putting it. I don't know why I did that. Probably just because I'm recording and a little bit nervous, right? So, and then every iteration, we're going to iterate through this value. But this is one way how you would iterate through an array. You would say, hey, while I is less than the length of the array, go ahead and increase by 1. And then if we wanted to get that value of the array, we would just pass I in like so. Let's give a different example though. We're going to create a variable here called total, and we're set total equal to 0. And then instead of a string, let's go ahead and pass in a bunch of values here. 0. We'll pass in a bunch of, instead actually, let's eliminate the array altogether and just hard code a value here. So while I is less than 5, I++. So what we want to do here, comment this out for the time being, we just want to say total, remember that plus equals, I. And we just want to add all the values of I together, and then at the end here we'll go ahead and return total, comment this back in, and you'll see here we get 10, right? So what is total as we're going through? You'll see total starts off as 0 and then adds 0, nothing happens, and then it adds 1, cool, 1 adds a 0, and then it adds 2, 1 plus 2 is 3, and then it goes another loop, and then it goes. And we can console.log the value of I as we do it, just to make it a little bit more clean. But you'll see here, we're adding 0, then 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, and then we're getting our final value here, which is 10. So for loops are used when we need to do a set amount of iterations. And that's really their purpose, is when we need to essentially just repeat code that we, for a set amount of times. That's why we use for loops. So let's talk about switch statements a little bit. What is a switch statement? A switch statement is something that you want to do when you are trying to, when you know the answers of a value, and you are going to say, hey, if it's this value, do something. If it's this other value, do something. Let's give an example. So let's set a string here, and we'll go ahead and change this total to example, and we'll comment this out. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a switch statement which takes in a value. In our case, we're going to pass in our variable here, example, and it's going to check what we call a case here. And we're going to say if the case is Dylan, we want it to do something. But let's say it's my last name. We could then say console.log last name. And then we're going to use this break keyword. The reason we do this is so that it exits out of the switch statement. That's what that break is there. Now we're going to set another case where if it is Dylan, which it is, right? Which example is equal to Dylan, we would just want to console.log first name. And you'll see it hits it because it is Dylan. And then we, of course, as I mentioned, want to break this as well to exit out of the loop. The reason for that is, in theory, we could actually have multiple cases that do multiple things. It's bad convention. We don't want to do that. The only reason you wouldn't use a break statement here is if you're using a return statement, which would automatically break you out of the loop. And last but not least, we have this default statement. You can think of this as our else, where if all the cases fail, we have a default statement where, okay, it's not first name, it's not last name. So in our example, I guess it's got to be middle name, right? And then we'll say must be middle name. It's not in this case, but let's go ahead and save it. So if we change this to Israel, our case here is Israel. We're passing an example into our switch statement, and we're saying, hey, this case, in the case that it's Israel, go ahead and print that out, and then exit this switch statement. Now, if we didn't have that, let's go ahead and just comment this out. You'll see that we're going to have some issues where now this can actually go and hit this, and that's why we need the break statement, even though it's not right because of how wonky switch statements are. So make sure you break your statements. And same thing with default, although in theory you don't need to for default. I actually couldn't tell you if it's good convention or not anymore to use breaks. The reason why you don't really need to use it for default, it's last value. There's nothing to run after it. But you'll see here we have Israel. And let's say we put coding God in here. We'll get, hey, must be middle name, right? Because this failed, and by default, that's its value. So that's switch statements. All right, so while loops are particularly fun because you're most likely to create an infinite loop. An infinite loop is bad code you wrote that will never exit out, right? You know how our for loop runs 5 times and it never exits out of the code. Essentially, you can do very easily with a while loop and then break your code. So be careful when you're using while loops. It's not the end of the world or anything. We all write infinite loops all the time, but just something I wanted to mention. So let's say we don't know how many times we want to run we need to run our code a set amount of times. We don't know what that set is. We can use a while loop, and then we'll just go ahead and create a variable here that we'll call this count. We'll just make it 10. And we'll say while true. So now you'll see here that our code is breaking, right? Because we never exit out of the code. We don't do anything with this. And so it's actually getting a little slow right now. So what we want to do is we want to break out of this loop after, you know, instead of true, let's say while count is greater than 0. And so we're going to go ahead and create a variable, or we'll say, hey, every iteration count minus equals 2. So minus 2 from every count, otherwise console.log count. And so you'll see we'll run this 5 times and then break out of here. You could also do while true, because really this is all it's evaluating to is a true or false statement that we're not sure how many times it's going to run. And we do something like, so you'll see it's not printing here because this is an infinite loop. We haven't actually, in our while loop, excuse me, we haven't actually put any way for it to break the loop, which is why this isn't printing out, because it would print out an infinite amount of numbers right now in a negative direction. And so we can go ahead and do something, well, you know, if count is less than or equal to, I don't know, 5, we can do return false. That'll break us out. We can also just do break. That'll break us out. And now you'll see we'll get 8, 6, 4. And this 4 runs again, right? Because even though because this runs above this. But that's a while loop. Sometimes we don't know how many times we're going to be running our code. In our case here, we're setting some basic logic to break out of it. But this is one way that we can run our code without knowing how many times it needs to run. All right, there's also the do while loop, which is very similar to the while loop, except the setup's a little bit different. And the main difference between a while loop and a do while loop is a do while loop will run at least one time. So how do we set that up? Well, we have a do right above our while loop, and then we have this brackets here where the main difference is our logic is going to be in the do loop, and then our while, we don't have these closing brackets. We're just going to essentially have our condition, which is, you know, 2 is less than 3 or something like that, which is, you'll see here, 2 is less than 2, 2 is less than 3. So when this is false, this is going to run at least one time, right? So that's why we get this 8. 2 is not less than 2. You know, while true, it's going to keep running until we break out of it here. But if this is false, it's going to do that one iteration with a do while loop. That's the only difference. It's a little bit different setup. Honestly, I can't even remember if I've ever written a do while loop in a application. It's not something I use too often, but it is worth noting. Right, the last thing that we're going to talk about is functions. I actually forgot to put this in here, so if you're wondering, like, oh man, Dylan looks like he's evolved, he's got a haircut, he looks a little younger, something like that, it is because I forgot to talk about functions. So what are functions? Well, functions essentially are ways that we can reuse our code at the end of the day and write reusable JavaScript so that we don't have to rewrite things time and time again. So let's go ahead and define a function called add here. And so basically our code is going to be between these curly braces, and then this is the name of our function. And right now, all we want to do is maybe return 5. And let's go ahead and launch our Quokka plugin real quick. And then say we want to console.log the add function, whatever that's returning back, right? It's going to return back 5. It should return 5. There we go. So you see 5. But let's say we want to do it again and again and again. You see the idea why we have these functions defined. Now let's make our function a little bit more complex. We want to add 2 numbers. So functions take in what are called arguments. You might hear the term parameters as well. They're pretty much interchangeable. You don't have to worry too much about it. But let's say we'll have this be num1, and we want to add to 5 here. We want to say 5 is plus whatever num1 value is, and we get not a number because we haven't put the value in here, but let's say we have 3, then we have 2, then we have 1, and so we can make our code not only dynamic, but we can also have the logic in our functions so that we don't have to rewrite the same logic again and again and again. As you progress in programming, you'll hear about solid principles, and one of those principles is don't repeat yourself. Is part of that's dry, but part of good coding is not repeating yourself. Is the point I'm trying to make. And so functions can also take in multiple parameters here. So we'll say this is num2. So basically the difference between parameters and arguments is parameters, num1 and num2 is parameters, but the actual values that we put into the function itself are the arguments. That's how you have to kind of think about it. So we could do 3 and 5, 2 and 2, and 1 and 1. And we're not doing anything with it, but if we wanted to, we can go ahead and add num2 to it. And of course, all the rest of our JavaScript that we wanted could work. So let's say we want to create a variable, create a constant, because we're not modifying it after this. Oops. Const total is equal to num1 plus num2. And then we just want to return the total. There we go. We'll get the values. So all our JavaScript, of course, works in functions, but it's just a very brief introduction to functions to get you going. Hey, baby, I just got done with my TLDR JavaScript video. Pretty exciting stuff.
Yeah, I just got done doing the dishes, doing the laundry, and cleaning the house. What are you gonna do?
Nothing. Quick thank to our sponsor, DevicePlus.com. If you guys are interested in Arduino and the Internet of Things, such as Raspberry Pis, might I recommend checking them out at DevicePlus.com. If you click the link in the top corner, it'll take you to a really cool thing. It's an intro beginner level tutorial of how to build a tripwire using Arduino. Check it out.